Paul Turton on ABC Newcastle.
Well, we've been following with a fair degree of interest the fight between landscape supplier Mulch and the Environment Protection Agency over mulching operations at the company's site in Toronto. Now, following a number of inspections, the EPA suspended the licence needed to conduct mulching operations at the site. The suspension was based on the company's failure to install leachate and stormwater controls on site while continuing to receive waste. And the EPA says that's in breach of both the 2015 Lake Macquarie City Council development consent and the licence conditions. The company challenged that decision and took the fight to the Land and Environment Court, where they had mixed success. But at the end of the day, the court ruled that the EPA acted within its powers in issuing that suspension notice and ordered that the Environment Protection Licence be suspended until today, the 31st of January 2025, or until certain works were completed by Jet Group. Well, today is D-Day pretty much, so what happens next? Damien Jensen is a director of the company that owns Mulch and is with me now. Damien, good morning.
Good morning, Paul.
Did you do that work that's required under your development consent and the EPL, the Environment Protection Licence?
Yes, we did do the work. We've got plenty or sufficient environmental controls in place, and that was proved through the court. We had environmental experts, two of them, one from the EPA and one from ourselves. So that was two environmental independent experts, and they proved with all the evidence and support that the controls in place are doing the job.
Now, in the Land and Environment Court, you agreed that you had breached the licence. Isn't this just a fair cop? Or didn't your own environmental expert agree that the contamination detected by the EPA was at least in part caused by composting activity carried out on the site?
No, that was not agreed because it hasn't been proved where the contamination has come from. And the contamination is on site and it is not doing any harm. That's what the court actually proved, that there is a very small increase in ammonia in one point, which is well inside our boundary. It's been there since 2011, and it is on a continual downhill trend. And our latest water testing actually came in yesterday, and it's 0.3 above the criteria, so 0.3 above the criteria, and it has never done harm. It has never left the site.
I understand that no chemicals are used in the mulch and composting processes. Is that true? And if so, where did those higher levels of ammonia come from initially?
Yes, so ammonia is a natural occurring element, and it's naturally formed from the decomposition of organics. So in the natural environment, you've got trees that drop their leaves, so all that foliage on the ground, as that breaks down, as it does throughout the whole whole bushland, natural environment, that creates nitrate and ammonia, completely natural occurring element.
Damien, what happens now? This is the final day, of course, the date set by the Land and Environment Court. I understand that this fight has almost sent you broke. What will happen if the EPA extends the suspension?
It will completely devastate our business. I've been in this business 25 years, and it's just killed us. The EPA are not interested in the environment. That's what the court case proved. They are not interested in working with us to find any sort of outcome. All they are set on doing is closing us down. They have absolutely no interest in working with us. They're trying to shut us down while they're allowing the large polluters to continually, day by day, breach massive amounts of pollution throughout the environment. Disgusting trends.
Now, you believe that you've been unfairly treated, and I know that on the basis of your complaint to them, the EPA is currently conducting an internal review into the impartiality of its staff in the handling of this matter, including the management of potential conflicts of interest. But still no concessions for you?
No, absolutely no concessions. My belief is their internal review will simply come out with the result that they've done nothing wrong. They've been looking at this for 2.5 years. They have absolutely no interest in showing what they've done wrong, and that's shown across the industry. There are massive polluters out there, and they are putting all of their resources, millions of taxpayers' dollars, into fighting me.
Damien, thanks for coming on and sharing your perspective.
All right, thanks, Paul.
Well, New South Wales Greens MP Sue Higginson has attempted to intervene in this fight and joins me now. Sue Higginson, good morning.
Good morning, Paul.
Now, the EPA argues that it's, Damien's emotional there, as you can well determine from hearing him, but the EPA argues that it's just doing its job without fear or favour, and we want them to keep us safe, of course. But should the EPA be allowing a suburban garden mulch distributor to be consuming so much of their resources? You know, multiple property raids, Land Environment Court challenges, all the ensuing legal fees, and now an internal review. Has the response been proportionate to the risk?
Look, when you look at all of the evidence, it doesn't seem that it has been commensurate with the risk. And this draws really us to be asking a much bigger question about the EPA and the EPA's functions. We know EPA has a whole load of regulatory functions, and we can see where those regulatory functions are really not up to task. For example, we saw the asbestos and heavy metal pollution in the mulch, recovered fines, soils and garden products. We're seeing chemical regulation and spray drift failure. The enforcement of the native forestry logging rules, the air and water pollution from mining, and now, of course, we've got the dilemma around PFAS and the balls of toxic sewage pollution washing up on our most popular beaches of Sydney. So you sort of got to ask, well, look, we know we need a tough, independent regulator when it comes to protecting the environment and protecting us from building on this toxic legacy we found ourselves in. But who is looking at the EPA's functions? And when we call those into question, who do we go to? And I think this is what is highlighted so clearly through Damien and Mulch's case. There is no one that we can go to. We know the last time we looked legally and structurally at the EPA was around 2011 after the big Orica problems at Kooragang Island. And we had a full EPA restructure where we saw an independent body formed, a CEO who's accountable to the board. But we've got a real problem because there's no oversight of that system. Like, for example, we have independent tough cops on the beat, like ICAC, for example, where we're looking at corruption. We have an oversight body. We have a joint standing or select committee of the Parliament. But when it comes to the EPA, there is no accountability above and beyond the EPA. It's the public. And it's very, very difficult for the public to be able to hold the EPA to account. I think that we have hit the point, and Damien's case is one of many cases that have come to my attention. We've hit that point where it's time to have an independent inquiry where we can look at whether the structure of the independent, very important environmental regulator is fit for purpose in terms of the accountability, the appeal mechanisms and the transparency. We know the Land and Environment Court is in certain circumstances an available mechanism for accountability, but my goodness, it can send appellants to rack and ruin because of the costs and the time it takes.
Well, the Land and Environment Court in this particular case, of course, found that the EPA had acted within its powers. It wasn't in a position to determine whether or not discretion had been wisely used, given that there are other options available in this particular case. And it sounds like Damien Jensen is not too confident about the internal review process that's underway at the EPA. How do you feel about that? Do you think that reviews of this nature should be held in-house?
No, I really don't. We know that what good practice models of accountability look like, and when you put the fox in charge of the hen house, you know that we're not going to get any justice for the hens, and we're certainly not going to get any advancement in better regulatory practice, accountability and transparency. I mean, we shouldn't be afraid of external scrutiny and accountability on bodies that have regulatory functions. We know that's a best practice model. I actually find it quite alarming that in 2025 we don't have an oversight, accountability or transparency model around holding the very important in EPA as the independent regulator to account. The Land and Environment Court, we must remember, whilst it is a form of appeal avenue for members of the community or proponents, it has quite limited jurisdictional powers and functions of oversight. We need those broad powers of oversight where procedural fairness is a real life matter, and we can really call into question the EPA's functions. And I am certain many of those officers of the EPA would like further accountability and transparency through their functions. And I don't think anybody wants to be a law unto themselves when it comes to regulation and having very strong powers. We need the EPA to be a tough cop on the beat, and we need them to have good sharp teeth and strong muscle when it comes to pulling polluters into line. But we also mustn't lose sight of how we're doing that. We need good strategies in place, and the EPA needs to feel certain that it has the right powers and the right oversight mechanisms so it can be confident in the work it does.
Sue Higginson, just one final point on the Mulch case. You wrote to the CEO of the EPA asking him to consider deferring any final decision, which is due today, of course. What happens next, the EPA has to determine. You asked for a deferral on any regulatory action against the company until that internal review is complete. Why did you argue for that concession?
Because that is the rules of procedural fairness. If somebody is making an allegation on good basis that something has gone wrong with the EPA's functions and the way they have exercised their power and functions, and, you know, the EPA has admitted and agreed to doing an internal review of those functions. If it was taking that incredibly serious, understanding the full consequences of the EPA's regulatory action on Mulch, then it could have exercised its discretion and said, look, you're right, let's take a deep breath here. No environmental harm is currently happening. Let's look at what has happened and what has gone wrong. And let's remember here, the Mulch business is about producing a good product. It's about taking products out of the landfill, the waste cycle. It's exactly the kind of business that we need if we are going to get to a more sustainable circular waste economy. All we asked for was a pause on the strong arm, and unfortunately the EPA wrote back and said, no, we'll do the review separately and we'll carry on. I think that's a degree of impunity that comes through there because there is no other body that we can go to and say, hey, can you also suggest that the EPA put a pause on any regulatory action whilst this review is being undertaken?
Sue Higginson, I appreciate your input today. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.
Sue Higginson is a Greens MP and spokesperson for the environment. Joining us on 12:33 ABC Newcastle, where it's 9:24, we reached out to the EPA, who issued a statement, many elements of which I've included in that interview by virtue of questions to our guests. But the EPA has confirmed that in May 2023, following a thorough investigation of the company's premises and multiple breaches of their operating conditions, namely that they failed to install leachate and stormwater controls on site while continuing to receive waste, was in breach of the 2015 Lake Macquarie City Council development consent and also the licence conditions. EPA testing of the groundwater downstream found ammonia up to 10 times above the guideline values. It's interesting to point out that word downstream is a bit misleading because it assumes or it tends to mislead in regard to the pollutant entering the water system. Downstream means at a lower point, and the evidence was in this particular case that the material, the ammonia, hadn't escaped from the property. The EPA goes on to say we have a range of regulatory options available to us, such as clean-up notices, prevention notices and licence suspension. There's no requirement to use regulatory action sequentially, and in this case, a licence suspension was considered the most appropriate action to take. And the EPA goes on in that statement to make other points which I've raised over those previous interviews.